course, of course. So we'll dive right in, and if you can share a little bit more about what the OVO Fund, what's the OVO Fund?
Yeah, absolutely. So OVO is a super early stage fund. At the end of the day, we want to be involved in that first round of institutional capital raised. Sometimes it's called pre-seed, sometimes it's the super angel round, but essentially we want to get involved super early. So the fund is really general and sector agnostic, but mostly around capital efficient companies. And so about 1/3 of the portfolio falls under e-commerce consumer sectors, and then the other 2/3 is smart enterprise companies. And then we're based in the Bay Area. And most of our investments are in the Bay Area, but then we also have a few in the LA and New York geographies.
Great. And how and what size check do you write? And I know it sounds like really early stage. Like, can you talk about
Yeah.
what size check you write, and then also how do you find some of these great companies?
Yeah, that's a good question. So our typical check size in that first round is 250 to 500K, and then we reserve some for follow-on. But the follow-on typically takes place at the latest in that Series A round because staying true to our fund, we want to be super early stage. But yeah, in terms of how we find investments, I think like with most super early funds, one thing that we place a really big premium on is the founder and the founder market fit. So to us, it's kind of like asking the question of why is this founder the best person to start this company in this space? And, a lot of that has to do with more than just, oh, because they're smart, because, there's a ton of smart people out there, but they don't necessarily make the best founders. So it has to do with the reason the founder and the founding team wants to start the company. And then the other thing for us is also the relationship aspect. We, it's really hard for us to meet a company today and make an investment in them tomorrow because we want to have that prior relationship. So to that extent, we try a lot to build relationships, not with just existing founders, but with aspiring founders that, maybe right now they're working at some big tech company and further down the line, they want to start a startup. And so we want to build those relationships with them at that point.
Got it. So what are some of the things you do earlier on to build relationships with those founders, just so that they're
Yeah.
aware of you, like before they even start?
Yeah, so there's a couple initiatives that we as a fund have. One is called the IP Create program, and for that one, we target PhDs and postdoc students as well as graduate students that are working on most of the time something technical, and we help them with the business side of things. So a lot of times you'll have a PhD student, they spent so many years working on this research, but when it comes time to well, what's the best business application for this research? That's when we help them, and that's through people we bring in on the business side of things. Um, but even with like undergraduates and other types of students, we want to stay really close with that community as well. So we have things like office hours, workshops. We actually have a summer fellowship program as well. And so just this month, 3 different teams from different schools started. And the idea of that program is to give them non-equity funding so that they can focus full time for the duration of the summer on a project that, they're really interested on.
Got it.
Mhm.
And how did you end up at OVO Fund?
Yeah, so my first stint in VC was when I was in college through a summer internship at Signia, which is also an early stage fund in the Bay Area. And then when I graduated from college, I joined Silicon Valley Bank and did a rotational program where, I bounced from team to team, kind of figuring out what I like to do. But Silicon Valley Bank is by far all venture debt. And that's very different than the equity side of things on, as venture capital funds do. And so I think that most people, and I agree with this, what they will say is how they found their path to VC. It's very nonlinear, and it really comes to you putting yourself out there and really talking to people that, are involved in VC or adjacently involved in other spaces to VC. And so for me, that just meant talking to people about my interest. And, the partner also went to Stanford, so I was able to connect with him through that.
Great. And for those that you seem to make all the, that's an awesome move, right? I think Silicon Valley Bank, and then going into your own fund. Did you you grew up in the Bay Area?
No, no, not at all. I don't think I even knew what venture capital was until like my sophomore or junior year in college. I grew up in Mexico and then also in Houston, Texas. So, like, to be honest, to this day, my parents don't know really well what I do. But yeah, it was definitely something that I was first exposed to in college.
And now during the, we're in the time of COVID, people are
Mhm.
still quarantining in different areas. Can you share a little bit about where you are and how you're still staying
Yeah,
connected to the entrepreneurial community
yeah.
in the Bay, and also where you are? Yeah, we'd love a little color on that.
Yeah, so it's definitely a little tough because especially as a super early stage fund when, we can't do everything on Zoom. Sure, we can do a lot of it, but I think to be honest, we're still figuring out how to get comfortable with making an investment over Zoom. So essentially never having met the person in real life because there is some elements of those soft skills that we just don't get over a Zoom call, or at least we haven't figured out how, but we are exploring different ways, just being very realistic of the current situation. But in terms of how I stay connected with the community in the Bay Area, with entrepreneurs and other investors, I think one thing that has come out of this, unfortunate situation is that people are more willing to hop on Zoom calls. And so, I've been sort of doing a lot of catch ups with investors within my network. And that's always good just to like stay top of mind for them, especially since we're such an early fund. Sometimes we see things that are too early for them but could be interesting for us. And also on the flip side of that, when our pre-seed companies are ready to raise their seed or maybe even their Series A funding rounds, then it's just good to know what other investors are investing in terms of sectors. um, but it is definitely tricky. I think that as soon as we can, we do want to start having sort of socially, social distance type of meetings, whether it's like outside via a hike or like a picnic. That's something that we want to do when we can.
Absolutely, being safe about it. And currently you're in Houston, correct?
Yes, yes. So I've been here for the last 3 months. I left California really soon after sort of things started to get locked down because I worried that it would get to the point where I couldn't fly out.
Got it. And can you share a little bit more about your insight into the Houston ecosystem?
Yeah. Well, to be honest, I'm not sure if I'm the best person to ask that because we don't really have a single portfolio company in Houston. And that's because, again, we really value that face to face communication. And so it definitely helps when we're physically located in the same space as our founders. And like, it's a lot easier for us to be helpful to a Bay Area company than per se an Austin based company. Although, like, if you talk about Texas as a tech hub, I do think Austin is sort of the first obvious place to look for. Um, but yeah, Houston is still really early in terms of that. I find that most early stage investments are in sort of like the oil industry here, at least. And also, I recently saw like an air conditioning company that got funded a Series A here, which is, it definitely makes sense because it's like 95 degrees every day here. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Can you talk a little bit more about how you're helping your portfolio companies in the time of COVID, and some of the challenges they're facing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, a lot of venture capitalists right now are doing this triaging of their portfolio thing where you kind of got to figure out where your companies each are and have very honest conversations with the founders, because I think the most important thing is to check on the state of the founders and how they're doing, and just like mentally how things are for them, because not only because that's a thing that any human being should do, but because it really does affect their businesses. And so, after we've done that, we have been spending more time talking to our portfolio companies and helping them figure out what their next steps are. And I think in general, our recommendations have been, look, you're in a good position if you're sort of like a super scrappy 1 or 2 person company, working in your apartment, in your garage, and you can kind of survive on a really lean monthly burn. and make it through this. If you can do that, then we recommend they do that. The other sort of space where some of our companies are at is, maybe they've just raised a larger seed round, and then they can, they have runway and capital to sort of like make it through the next 24 months, because I do think it's going to be tougher to raise in this next at least 12 months, honestly. And we've seen a couple of our companies face that as well. But yeah, those are some of the conversations that we've been having with our portfolio companies. And it also depends on the space. Like for a lot of the consumer companies, we recommend that they maybe, because we're so early, so a lot of them are pre-revenue, but it's important that they start having those potential revenue monetization strategies earlier than they might have if COVID-19 hadn't came the way it did.
Great. I know another, especially with COVID. I think that's great advice. It's like how it's like right now it's just every company's trying to hold and stay lean to weather the time. But I don't want to ignore well, doubling back on the current events, talking about the protests related to institutional racism and how we can better aid and help the Black community and community of color at large. Can you share a little bit how has that impacted your portfolio at all, or your conversations with founders or venture capitalists?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard nowadays, especially this past week, to go into conversations and not bring that up, just because it is so top of mind for everyone. And I mean, it's all over the internet. And I mean, I think it's good that these conversations are happening. I think they're definitely long overdue. And it's kind of sad that, it had to be such a tragic event for these conversations to be taking place. But like, I myself am part of the Latino community, and I see a lot of parallels with that community as well. So I'm glad these conversations are taking place. But I definitely think we are in the early days of, where we should be in terms of the venture ecosystem doing something about it, and, actually putting their money where their mouth is, per se.
And can you share what in your mind holds the community back from doing that, from putting their money into more Black founders, more underrepresented founders? What's holding that back?
Yeah, I think it's not just one thing, but for example, one thing that I think about a lot is where our funnel of portfolio companies are coming from, because I think the problem really does start at the top of the funnel. If to begin with, you're not seeing a lot of companies of people of color or female founders, then, less of those are going to turn into real investments. And for me, I want to back the best founders. And I really think the best founders come from all sorts of communities, not just from the ones that we typically see get the most investment dollars. And our fund isn't just a, female fund or like a people of color fund, but I think that we try really hard at seeing startups from across a variety of communities. And that's definitely something that we need to be better at. But at least since I joined, I know that we have been doing better. In fact, that kind of inspired the investment thesis that I'm currently working on, which is targeting startups that have a target audience of US Hispanics. So, I've been spending the last 8 months and could talk endlessly about this, but the more general summary is that nearly 25% of the US population is Hispanic, yet there really isn't brands that are targeting the US Hispanic like there are targeting, maybe their white counterparts or other communities. And I think that's the same across different minority communities. And there's a lot of really interesting data around why it's not just good to target this US Hispanic audience, but like, financially speaking, it makes a lot of sense. Not only do Hispanics spend twice as much on video, on mobile, but they're actually twice as likely to engage with ads, which is really interesting to think about from a startup and how they go about paid marketing.
Great. And can you share a little bit more about what type of research you're doing and how are you developing this thesis? Like, what are you finding?
So I think developing a thesis it's definitely very time consuming. And for me, it's sort of meant to be a living, breathing piece of work that changes and alters with time. But to me, as I've been developing this thesis, the most important thing is really talking to founders that are working in these sectors. So talking to founders that their startups are targeting this US Hispanic, millennial Gen Z age person. Apart from that, there's a lot you could do online, but also just talking to people that sort of have voices in this ecosystem, which is interesting because there actually isn't that many, at least, the more narrow and niche I get into my thesis. And I'll be publishing that soon, so I'm excited for that.
Great. And what are you noticing is the difference between, you would say, um, Latinx founders and other founders at large? And the reason I ask,
Yeah.
so
So
I'll let you go. Go ahead.
yeah, maybe I'm biased because I myself am Latina, but I definitely think they're just a lot more resilient. Like I see a lot of these founders, and in my mind, I think maybe this isn't a venture backable business, but heck, I know this person is gonna go and go and go and pursue it to the very end. And I find that to be the case with a lot of Latino founders. It's just that like sense of resiliency, and I think that comes all the way from the culture of Hispanics, and I think they're more just like resilient and gritty and scrappy, maybe not because out of pleasure, but because that's what the way they had to be to succeed. And I think there's something to be said about that and how that translates into a great founder.
And so you're focused on, do you have any particular insight behind your focus in the Hispanic market? Is it just the product and service and serving the Hispanic market in the US? Does it matter the origins of the founder?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Just to get like a filter, I am focusing just on like Hispanics and Latinos living in the US because I think as you expand out, it becomes too broad. But just within the US, I definitely notice that in terms of who the founder of this company are, they do need to have some way to connect with their audience. So I'm not necessarily saying the founder needs to be a Latino as well. But for example, if you're targeting, I'm just making something up, like owners of Mexican grocery stores, then you do need to have a sense of how they do business, of how they get comfortable with a business client or partner in any sort of way. So this other founder doesn't need to be Hispanic, but they do need to have lived the Hispanic life, for lack of a better word. And that's through being involved in that community. Like, for example, if you live in LA, you probably are involved with that community because there's just like more Hispanics there. Same thing with Texas. Like, yeah, I'm Hispanic, so I know a lot of Hispanics here, but there definitely is a community.
Yeah, that's great. And in light of some of the like administrative changes, especially with the focus on not supporting immigrant founders, like what do you think we can do to better support immigrant founders here in the US?
Yeah, I think from a regulatory perspective, it is really hard for immigrant founders to simply start businesses, which sucks because that just limits the amount of people that can start businesses. And especially if you think about right now when the unemployment rate is really high, I do think that's going to drive a lot of founders and a lot of non-existing founders right now to become founders and entrepreneurs in the coming months and years. And it sucks if the reason that can't happen is because they don't have a piece of document that they need to have. I do think it's tricky though, but I think that, there are a couple people in Silicon Valley and other areas that are helping with that. So yeah, I'm definitely for it.
Taking no, I appreciate the insight. What's next for you and the OVO Fund? What's some initiatives you guys are working on coming up?
Yeah, so one thing we've been doing a lot is spending a lot of time thinking about what this post-corona world looks like because, a lot of the more obvious trends are sort of like the consumerization of healthcare or e-learning trends that are likely, or at least I believe are likely to stay past the pandemic. But I think it's also really important to think about the second order trends of the pandemic. So for example, like I previously alluded to, there's this huge amount of people that are out of a job, right? So what do you do with those type of people? And I think thinking about entrepreneurship, one way to think about it is, okay, so there's all this sort of like gig economy workers that are looking to do something. So maybe there's a way that a startup can leverage them for, you know, a sort of funding that they're able to provide. And I know a couple of startups are doing this. For example, there's the beauty company Il Maquillage, which is hiring a bunch of makeup artists, which, you know, don't have a job right now, and sort of helping them do virtual makeup tutorials with their audience, which is, you know, in the beauty space. But in other sectors that can also exist. So yeah, that's one thing I've been spending a lot of time looking at. What can be done with this mass population of people that are out of a job? And a little bit relevant to that is this whole world of the creator economy, because it's also people that are, you know, trying to find ways to make revenues in ways that are new and novel. And so these are spaces that I look at a lot and think about from that perspective, from how can you open a new revenue making stream to these different groups.
Yeah, and it's almost these different groups are coming out of necessity, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
With these secondary channels. So no, great. So appreciate you. Thank you, and for what we've. Thank you very much for your time. And again, this is so. Let me pause. I'm going to edit that out. So, no. So thank you very much, Ilse, for joining us today. This is Ilse Calderon, Senior Associate at the OVO Fund, sharing some of her insights. So and enjoy Houston. And again, this is Rebel One Live. Come join us to hear more impact founders and investors that are making waves in the space. So check us out. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sergio.